I arrived in the village on a Monday morning, just as the mist was lifting off the hills. The road curved through a narrow valley, the kind that felt carved more by time than water. The place barely registered on maps, a forgotten hamlet somewhere in the Carpathians, where the internet cut out after the last bus stop and the signal bars vanished as soon as you entered the woods. I wasn't here for the view. I was part of a restoration team hired by a cultural heritage fund to begin structural assessment on an abandoned 18th century church. Most of it was rotting, but that's exactly why we were here. The church sat on a hill, surrounded by what remained of an old cemetery, crumbling crosses, sunken graves, the occasional rusted fence post. No one had been buried there in decades. Nature had taken the place back. The building itself looked like it had held its breath and waited to collapse. Stone walls leaned inwards, the roof was half gone, and inside, the floorboards creaked like joints ready to snap. But the bell tower, that was intact. A narrow spiral of stone leading up to a square chamber where the old church bell still hung. It was massive, blackened by weather, streaked green from age but whole. Its tongue still swung freely, rusted at the edges. The villagers had told us to leave it alone, not as a warning, just offhandedly, like a passing comment you're not meant to question. But it stood over us each day like a threat nobody wanted to talk about. We were just 2 people on site that week, myself and a local contractor named Victor, hired for the early clearing and prep work. On the second day after lunch, we climbed the tower out of curiosity. The wooden steps were warped but held. The higher we went, the colder it got. When we reached the chamber, sunlight filtered in through a lattice of cracks. Dust hung in the air like static, and in the center, the bell loomed over us like a relic from some forgotten war. Victor leaned over the edge and laughed, pointing out that the thing still had its rope. He gave it a few test pulls, nothing more than a vibration in the air. Then, with a quick grin, he yanked the cord. The sound that followed wasn't loud. It didn't ring out like church bells should. It was low, guttural, like metal straining under some deep pressure. It didn't echo across the hills. It folded in on itself, as if the valley didn't want it to be heard. We stood there, listening. Then the silence returned, heavier than before. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because of the bell, not yet. There was just something off, like the woods had changed shape. I'd gone for a short walk near dusk, out toward the tree line that wrapped behind the cemetery. Birds that should have been calling weren't. Crickets had stopped. Everything had that tight, muffled sound, like the air had thickened and was pressing in on itself. I went back to the trailer, locked the door, and told myself I was just tired from the drive. But the next morning, something had changed. Victor looked uneasy. He said nothing, but he kept glancing toward the church tower. The villagers who'd once come up the hill to chat or offer supplies now kept their distance. Even the dogs that used to wander through the lot disappeared. The place felt deserted, but not abandoned. Not entirely. By the end of the week, we weren't working in the church anymore. We were working around it, and at night I started hearing things. Not voices, not footsteps, just a sound. A low, metallic creak, irregular, distant, as if it came from the tower, like the bell shifting. Breathing. I never heard it ring again, but it no longer felt still. By the 6th day, the silence had grown unbearable. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence in itself, like the world around the church was holding its breath. Even the wind avoided the hilltop. Trees stood still. Shadows hung longer than they should. Victor stopped showing up. He didn't call, didn't pack up his things. His tools were still scattered near the outer wall where he'd last been chiseling away at ivy-covered stone. I knocked at his door in the village that evening. An older woman opened, probably his aunt, and gave me a polite but guarded smile. Said he'd left for a few days. Didn't know where. Didn't invite questions. So I worked alone the next day, or pretended to. I took photos, made a few notes, walked the perimeter, but I didn't enter the church. I couldn't bring myself to. The interior felt too still. The light through the broken windows seemed wrong, as if coming from a different sky. Instead, I wandered through the overgrown graveyard behind the apse, partly out of obligation, partly out of some half-formed suspicion. Many of the gravestones were worn smooth by time. Names had crumbled into moss. A few still held letters, dates, ornate Orthodox carvings. All forgotten people left to rot beneath dry earth. I stepped carefully. The ground felt soft in places, like something had been dug and refilled recently. But no markings showed it. No disturbances. Just the sense of something unsettled. One grave caught my eye. It wasn't the largest or the oldest. In fact, it looked newer than the rest, maybe a century old. The stone had fractured cleanly down the middle, splitting a name I couldn't fully read. What made me stop was the dirt around it, not disturbed, but sunken, lower than it should have been, as if the grave were slowly collapsing into itself. At the base of the broken stone was a small wooden cross, no bigger than a hand carved, darkened with age, and stuck awkwardly into the earth, not like a marker, but like an offering, or a warning. I reached down to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, a sound rang out behind me. It wasn't loud, not like a bell ringing, but sharp, distinct and wrong. A chime, maybe. A metal-on-metal vibration that trembled through the air like something had been struck. I turned. The church tower loomed over the trees. No movement. No rope swaying. Nothing visible. But I felt it again, that same low pressure in the air, like the atmosphere itself had exhaled. I backed away from the grave and left the cemetery without taking more notes. My mind ran in circles the rest of the day. I told myself it had been a bird, a branch, something natural echoing off stone, but the sound hadn't come from the woods. It had come from above. That night I locked every window in my trailer. I turned off the lights and lay still, waiting. Hours passed. At some point I must have dozed off. Then, around 3 a.m., I woke with a start. Not to a noise, but to a feeling. Heavy air. A pressure inside the trailer. And through the condensation on the window, I saw movement outside. A shape. Tall. Still. It stood near the edge of the graveyard, close to where I'd found the fractured tombstone. Too far to make out details, but too still to be anything natural. Not an animal, not a shadow, just watching. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, and in that suffocating silence I thought I heard it again, distant, trembling, metallic, a single note from the bell. By the time dawn broke, the figure had vanished. No footprints. No evidence it had ever been there, but I didn't sleep again. I waited in my trailer, eyes locked on the graveyard, my breath fogging up the cold glass. The sun brought no comfort. If anything, it made everything worse. The light didn't feel real thin and weak, like it passed through dirty water before touching the ground. The hilltop air was heavy, and birds still refused to return. I should have packed up then, called the university, left the project behind like Victor had, but some part of me needed to understand. I needed to know what the hell was going on inside that church. So I went back. The front doors groaned as I pushed them open, but they didn't resist. The nave was unchanged. Dusty beams of light cutting across floating moats, shattered glass crunching beneath my boots. I made myself walk down the center aisle, forcing each step. And then I saw it. At the base of the bell tower, in the back left corner of the church, the trapdoor was open. There hadn't been a visible door there before, just cracked flagstones. But now a square hole yawned in the floor, surrounded by disturbed dust and old wooden planks. A rope ladder descended into the dark. Something in me screamed to leave, but I didn't. I told myself I was documenting everything, that I'd write a report. But the truth was simpler. I felt pulled, as if something beneath that tower had been waiting. I descended slowly. Each rung groaned beneath my weight. The air grew colder, damper. The space widened into a narrow stone corridor beneath the church, older than the foundation above. Roots protruded from the walls. Carvings, barely legible, lined the stones, not crosses, but crude spirals and jagged figures. Shapes that made no sense, but filled me with unease. The passage ended in a small circular chamber. At the center, a pit, shallow at first glance, just a few feet deep. But when I leaned over and looked, the depth seemed to stretch forever. The darkness inside wasn't empty. It was full, dense. Something moved in it, slowly, like thick smoke underwater. Above the pit hung a rusted chain, and attached to it, the bell. Not the one in the tower, a different one, smaller, blackened with age, but unmistakably the same shape, and it was swaying, slowly, rhythmically, as if it had just been rung. I backed away, heart pounding, and that's when I noticed the bones. They were arranged in a circle along the wall, dozens of them, maybe more, small, child-sized, each placed neatly, reverently, as if in offering to whatever the bell was calling. One skull had a carved wooden cross between its jaws. I turned and climbed out, barely remembering how. I ran across the graveyard, past the broken stone, past the empty hole that hadn't been there yesterday. Another grave collapsed into itself. I didn't stop running until I was behind the wheel of my car, flying down the road toward the village. I never went back. Victor was never found. The church was quietly removed from the project list. When I contacted the university, no one questioned it. Maybe they knew. Maybe they didn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that sound again, metal on metal, ringing in the dark. Not loud, just enough. Enough to remind me the bell still swings, and it's not done calling. We weren't ghost hunters. Not really. We were urban explorers diggers, as some called us. We sought out ruins, catacombs, bunkers, the forgotten, the hidden. Sometimes we found nothing but rust and silence. Sometimes we found too much. This church wasn't even on the map. No marked roads led to it. We saw its spire from the drone footage, a blackened tooth jutting from the overgrown hills outside of Zylesk. Local archives called it St. Mercurius, abandoned since 1957, officially demolished in 1962. But it wasn't gone. We found it 2 days into our trip. The roof had partially collapsed. Ivy strangled the walls. The front door was missing, gaping open like a torn mouth. It was a miracle the structure hadn't caved in completely. I could still make out faint symbols above the archway, Latin, maybe Romanian. I wasn't sure. The script was cracked and moss-eaten. Inside, the nave stretched long and narrow, filled with rubble and shards of stained glass. Light filtered in through the broken roof, slicing through dust like underwater rays. Pews lay in broken rows. The altar was scorched, as if there had been a fire. But what caught our attention was the loft, the choir loft. It clung to the back wall above the entrance, about 12 feet off the ground. A decaying wooden staircase curled up to it, half its steps missing. From below, it looked unstable, like it would crumble under a breath. But it was still there, and no one had walked it in decades. We were 5: Sasha, Misha, Yulia, Anton, and me. Misha was the first to say it. Anyone else hear that? We stopped. There it was, faint, like wind through reeds. But no, it wasn't wind. It was singing, a slow, wordless hum, rising and falling in an ancient rhythm. A melody that didn't belong to this time. We laughed at first, joked about hidden speakers, or maybe wind playing tricks in the beams. But it didn't stop. It grew more distinct, male, low and sorrowful. Anton, ever the brave one, climbed the staircase before any of us could argue. He waved off our warnings, flashlight in one hand, recorder clipped to his shoulder strap. "Relax, just recording the acoustics," he said. The last thing we saw was his silhouette reaching the landing. The last thing we heard was his voice saying, "Wait, someone's already." Then silence, no scream, no fall, just ... gone. We called for him, shouted up into the rafters. The singing had stopped. The loft was empty. When Sasha finally climbed up after him, all he found was Anton's recorder lying at the edge of the railing, still blinking red. He pressed play. What we heard next made every part of me go cold. First, Anton's footsteps on wood. Then, his whisper, "Hello? Is someone up here?" Followed by more footsteps, not his. Dozens of them, light and fast, like barefoot dancers. And then the singing returned. But this time it was no solo dot. It was a full chorus. Dozens of voices, men, women, children layered in unnatural harmony, growing louder, louder, until the sound cracked the mic. And finally, just before the recording cut off, Anton's voice, barely audible. "They're all looking down." Then, nothing. We didn't leave right away. Looking back, I wonder why. Any sane person would have bolted the second a friend vanished into thin air. But that's the thing about places like that church. They hold you. Anton was missing, but the recorder was real. His voice was real. The footsteps, the chorus, the last thing he said, they're all looking down real. We played the recording over and over again. It never changed. That final moment always made us flinch. A whisper surrounded by a wall of sound, then static. Yulia wanted to go to the police. Sasha argued they'd never believe us. What are we gonna say? He snapped. Our friend vanished inside a ghost church that officially doesn't exist? We searched every inch of the place. We climbed the loft. It groaned under our weight, but didn't collapse. There was no trapdoor, no hidden passage, no blood, No sign of Anton, just dust and mold, and an overwhelming feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. That night, we camped a short distance from the church, just beyond the tree line. The idea was to go back in the morning with more light, fresh eyes, try again. Maybe we missed something, but we didn't sleep. At 3:41, Sasha sat bolt upright in his sleeping bag. He looked wrong. His face was pale, eyes wide open. "They're standing in the trees," he said. We thought he was dreaming. Until we looked, they were everywhere. Figures tall and thin stood just within the shadows, completely still. Dozens of them, silent as gravestones, their heads were all tilted upward, not toward us, toward the sky, or maybe the church. We didn't speak. None of us moved. Not until the figures slowly turned to face us. No eyes, just smudges where faces should have been, like they were carved from ash. Then, as one, they opened their mouths. No sound came out, not at first. Then the humming began again, that same mournful tune from the loft, wordless, measured, beautiful in the worst possible way. It spread through the trees like fog, coiling around our tents, into our ears, under our skin. My stomach turned. I tasted metal. Yulia was the first to scream. We grabbed what we could and ran. No flashlight, no gear. Just into the woods, crashing through underbrush like panicked animals. The song never followed us, but the memory did, and we made a terrible mistake. We left Anton's recorder behind. We didn't talk for weeks after that night. Yulia moved back to her hometown without a word. Sasha stopped replying to messages. I tried to act like life was normal. I went to classes. I smiled. I slept with the lights on. But the silence grew heavier each day. Then the dreams started. Every night I'd find myself standing in that church. The nave stretched impossibly high. The pews full of blurred figures, heads bowed. The humming always began from above, and when I looked up there was the choir loft. Always empty, always waiting. And Anton he stood at the edge, looking down at me, mouth open. But no sound, just the chorus swelling behind him. I told myself it was grief, guilt, sleep deprivation. But then, exactly 40 days after he disappeared, the recorder arrived. No note, no return address, just a padded envelope sitting outside my apartment door. It was his, the scratches on the side, the cracked battery cover. I sat frozen, just staring at it, like it was ticking. Eventually, I pressed play. There was nothing for a full minute. Then footsteps. Heavy, slow, ascending stairs. The sound of wind against stained glass. And then his voice. "I think I'm still in the loft. I can see you. I can see all of you, but I don't think you can hear me anymore. The others are singing. They never stop. If you're listening, please, please don't come back." A pause. Then a whisper, almost too quiet to hear. We weren't supposed to see the loft empty. The tape clicked. Then silence. Except, not quite. Very faintly, from deep within the static, the chorus began. Soft, haunting, growing louder with each second the recorder stayed on. I snapped the recorder shut. Since then, I've moved twice. I burned the envelope. I haven't spoken to anyone who was there that night, but some nights at exactly 3:41, I air it again, not from a dream, not from a tape. From above. Somewhere in my apartment, the choir is still singing.